In this video, we will finally go in depth on the issue of positionality. It's a concept that has been mentioned in previous videos, and in this video, we'll look more into what is meant by positionality in qualitative research. The quick definition is that positionality is related to who you are, that is your identity and your background characteristics. And the idea is that who you are, your identity, your background, your characteristics will influence how you are positioned in relation to your research. So who you are can influence which research questions that you ask, how you get access to the field, and by the field I mean then the people you interview, the places where you do observation, the world out there where you are doing your research. And it will influence your relations and interactions with the research participants, whether you're doing interviews or you're doing observation. Your data collection involves meetings between you and real people out there. And who you are and your positionality will influence the nature of those encounters. And it will also influence how you analyze the empirical data that you have collected. So the researcher influences every single stage of the research process, not just the data collection, from formulating research questions to analyzing and publishing the results or the findings of your study. When we talk about positionality, it's often the two middle points here that are more in focus. Access to the field and relations and interactions with research participants. Those are also the 2 points that are mostly discussed in journal articles and other readings when positionality is brought up as a question. But you should be aware of that who you are will influence the research at all stages of the research process. And that's part of the package. It's not something you can avoid, but you should reflect on how your positionality has influenced your research. And that's something you would do in the method section of your research project or research report, usually then in a thesis in the method chapter. When talking about positionality, it's often common to make a distinction between an insider and an outsider position. And the idea then is that if you're an insider, you're kind of part of the group that you are doing research on. Whereas if you're an outsider, you're somehow positioned on the outside. You're different from the research participants. In reality, however, researchers will often be both an insider and an outsider in relation to the people involved in their research. You might be an insider in certain ways, and you might be an outsider in other ways. And because the issue of insider and outsider positions is more complex than just a black and white, you're either insider or outsider, I think it's useful when thinking about positionality to use some of these categories or markers of insider and outsider positions in order to be able to reflect upon how different characteristics of who you are might influence your access to the field and your relations with and interactions with research participants in different ways. Your name is a marker of who you are. It can indicate gender. It also can indicate your nationality or your ethnicity. Occupation and title. Do you present yourself as a student? Do you present yourself as a researcher? Do you present what do you present yourself as? Your gender, your age, your physical appearance, and by that I mean the color of your skin, how you look, and also related then to how you dress, your clothing style. Language is another marker of insider and outsider position. In an interview, what kind of language do you use in the interview? Are there several possible language you could use? And which one do you choose to use, and how does that influence the dynamic and the interaction between you and the interviewee. Do you choose the language that the interviewee is more comfortable with, or do you choose the language that you're more comfortable with? Cultural competence, your knowledge about cultural codes, your ability to interpret and understand cultural references that are being made in an interview or when you're observing. Religion or lack of religion. Parenthood, and related to parenthood, visible pregnancy, which of course will only be relevant for some, and personal experience. Do you share some of the personal experiences that you might interview people about? And these markers are used by research participants to define the researcher's position by matching these markers with existing social categories. Based on your physical appearance, you might be placed in one category or another category based on your gender, your clothing style, your occupation, your name, your age. You're placed within certain social categories. And of course, that kind of placing is also something you as a researcher do when you meet your research participants and also when you recruit them and sample. But that's another story. And the markers listed here, and this is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure you can include other markers depending on the focus of your research project. These markers, they vary in several ways. They vary in terms of how visible they are to research participants. Certain markers, you cannot hide them. Your gender is often difficult to hide, at least when you're meeting face to face. Maybe if you're just communicating through email, it's easier to hide it. Clothing style is more difficult to hide. Of course, occupation, you don't have to tell people that you're a student, but maybe it's natural to do it if you're asking them to participate in your master thesis. Parenthood is an example of a marker that can be hidden or it can be revealed. So that these markers vary in how visible they are and whether you as a researcher can communicate these markers selectively, choosing when and how to reveal certain pieces of information. And communicating these markers selectively can be a strategy used to build rapport and trust with research participants by creating a common ground, emphasizing the markers that make you similar and maybe downplaying the markers that emphasize more the difference between you and the research participants. Sometimes, of course, marking or emphasizing difference is also important. So these markers can be used strategically by the researcher to a certain extent. And you should then think about how you use these markers, how these markers are interpreted by the research participants, and also think about the research ethics involved in using these markers selectively. Is it ethically okay to hide certain kinds of information from the informant? Maybe it is, and maybe it's also justified by the fact that you don't want to influence the views and thoughts that the person expresses in an interview by revealing something about yourself that might indicate what you think about these issues. You want the interview to be open and feel free to share their own personal views and experiences. So this hopefully gave you a better idea about what positionality is all about. And the clue here and the difficult thing here is to try in a research project to reflect upon how you have been positioned as a researcher or how a researcher has been positioned, using these markers as a help to talk about and reflect upon positionality. We can never have a 100% overview of how we as researchers influence the research that we conduct. We can never step out of our own body, look at ourselves and the research we conduct from the outside, and have a complete overview of how we influence our research. But we should try to stop, try to reflect, and try to think through these issues, because that will make your method chapter much more interesting and much stronger if you include some of these reflections in the method chapter. And it also makes it easier for the reader to understand why you conducted the research in the way you did, why you came to the conclusions you did, why people answered the way they did, why you focus on certain things and not other things. So try to be as open and honest about these issues as possible. Good luck.